"It's unfixable," the billionaire CEO said, her voice calm enough to silence an entire auditorium. "If the best engineers in America couldn't solve it in 72 hours, nobody will solve it today." Hundreds of eyes turned toward the towering prototype standing beneath the bright white lights of Langford Robotics Innovation Center in Austin, Texas. The machine had frozen without warning just minutes before the company was scheduled to sign the largest artificial intelligence contract in its history, a deal worth nearly $2 billion. Investors whispered behind polished conference tables. Reporters adjusted their cameras. Senior engineers stared helplessly at glowing monitors filled with endless streams of diagnostics that refused to explain why the system had suddenly gone dark. The room buzzed with tension, the quiet hum of cooling fans mixing with hurried footsteps and anxious breathing. Victoria Langford stood perfectly still at the center of it all, her charcoal business suit as sharp as her reputation. At 36, she had built one of the fastest-growing robotics companies in the country by trusting facts instead of emotions, data instead of hope. Failure was something she analyzed, not accepted. Yet for the first time in years, uncertainty had found its way into her eyes. "We're out of time," one executive whispered. Another glanced toward the waiting investors and slowly shook his head. Across the room, two security guards stepped aside to allow a delivery man carrying a small equipment case through the service entrance. His faded denim shirt carried the stitched name Ethan Brooks above one pocket. His work boots were marked with years of honest labor, and a pair of worn leather gloves rested casually in one hand. Nobody paid much attention to him. He wasn't wearing an executive badge. He wasn't carrying a laptop worth thousands of dollars. He wasn't surrounded by assistants or speaking in technical jargon. He was simply there to deliver a precision-machined replacement bracket ordered 3 days earlier. One young engineer looked at him and laughed quietly. "Wrong place, buddy. This isn't the maintenance department." A few nearby employees smiled without looking up from their screens. Ethan offered nothing but a polite nod. He quietly placed the case on a nearby table and noticed the enormous silent machine surrounded by dozens of frustrated specialists. He didn't interrupt anyone. He simply listened. Every click of a relay, every uneven vibration from an idle cooling unit, every faint electrical pulse hidden beneath the silence seemed to settle naturally into his thoughts. Then Victoria crossed her arms and repeated with absolute certainty, "It's unfixable." Ethan finally raised his eyes toward the machine. His expression never changed. He didn't look impressed by its size or intimidated by the people surrounding it. After a long moment, he spoke so softly that only those closest to him heard the words. "Would you mind giving me 5 minutes?" The nearest engineers exchanged amused glances before one of them let out a quiet chuckle. 5 minutes? They had already spent 3 exhausting days searching for an answer. Yet something about the stranger's calm voice lingered in the air, and before anyone realized it, the noise inside the room began to fade, replaced by the kind of silence that often arrives just before everything people believe is about to change. The silence lingered for another heartbeat before someone finally laughed. It was not cruel enough to echo across the room, but it was confident enough to spread. A senior systems architect folded his arms and glanced at the stranger with polite disbelief. 5 minutes, he asked. "We have had 23 engineers working around the clock since Friday." Another engineer sighed as she rubbed her tired eyes. Every diagnostic passed. Every circuit tested. Every software rollback failed. There is nothing left to check. Ethan Brooks listened without interrupting. He had heard voices like these before, voices exhausted by effort and blinded by complexity. They were intelligent people, dedicated people, but sometimes the hardest thing for brilliant minds to do was to believe that the simplest answer had not already been eliminated. Victoria studied him from across the room. His posture bothered her more than his words. Most people either looked intimidated in front of executives or eager to impress them. Ethan looked like neither. He simply stood there holding his old equipment case as though he had all the time in the world. "What exactly do you do?" Victoria finally asked. Ethan answered with the same quiet honesty. "I own a small repair garage about 12 miles from here." A few smiles immediately appeared around the room. Someone whispered, "So now we are asking auto mechanics to save artificial intelligence." Another voice added, "Maybe he can rotate the tires while he is here." Soft laughter followed, then faded almost as quickly as it came. Ethan did not react. His attention remained fixed on the motionless prototype. He noticed a faint rhythmic click coming from somewhere beneath the lower access panel. It was subtle, almost hidden beneath the steady sound of the ventilation system, but it repeated with remarkable consistency. Tick, pause, tick, pause. His eyes narrowed slightly. Victoria noticed the change. "You hear something?" she asked. Ethan nodded once. "I hear something that does not belong." One of the lead engineers immediately replied, "That relay has already been replaced twice." Ethan looked toward him with genuine respect rather than disagreement. "I believe you," he said, "but I would still like to see it." The engineer hesitated, surprised by the absence of ego. There was no challenge in Ethan's voice, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only curiosity. Victoria slowly walked closer until they stood only a few feet apart. She noticed grease beneath his fingernails, tiny scratches across his weathered hands, and the faint crease where a wedding band had once rested. His eyes carried the quiet fatigue of someone who had spent years working long days without complaint. "You really believe you can help?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the silent machine before answering. "I believe every machine tells the truth. We only have to stop asking it the wrong questions." For the first time that morning, nobody laughed. The words settled over the room more heavily than anyone expected. They were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried the calm certainty of experience instead of pride. Victoria glanced toward the anxious investors waiting behind the glass conference wall. Every passing minute pushed the company closer to public embarrassment. She took a slow breath, weighing risk against instinct. Then she looked back at Ethan Brooks. 5 minutes, she said quietly. "That is all you get." Without another word, Ethan gently set down his worn equipment case, rolled up the sleeves of his faded denim shirt, and stepped toward the silent machine as if greeting an old friend he had not seen in many years. The giant prototype stood motionless beneath the white ceiling lights while dozens of engineers instinctively stepped aside. Nobody had asked them to move. They simply did, as though curiosity had quietly replaced confidence. Ethan walked around the machine without touching it. His footsteps were slow, measured, almost rhythmic against the polished concrete floor. He never glanced at the monitors displaying endless columns of system errors. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment and listened. The cooling fans maintained a steady hum. Hydraulic pumps rested in silence. Somewhere deep inside the lower chassis, the faint metallic click continued with unwavering precision. Tick, pause, tick, pause. Ethan knelt beside the access panel and rested 2 fingertips lightly against the aluminum housing. He felt a vibration so subtle that it escaped every digital sensor connected to the system. One young engineer frowned. "He is not even looking at the software." Another quietly replied, "Maybe he does not understand it." Victoria folded her arms again, saying nothing. She had spent years trusting measurable data, yet she could not ignore the unusual calm filling the room. Ethan finally spoke without looking away from the machine. "Who approved the final assembly?" A senior engineer answered immediately. "I did." There was pride in his voice, but also exhaustion. Ethan nodded respectfully. "Then I know it was assembled carefully." The engineer looked surprised. He had expected criticism, not appreciation. Ethan continued, "May I borrow a 1/4-inch wrench?" One was handed to him within seconds. He accepted it with a quiet smile and crouched. Lower, shining the small flashlight from his repair case beneath the frame. Dust reflected through the narrow beam like tiny stars. Every cable was perfectly organized. Every connector appeared secure. Every surface looked exactly as it should. Ethan smiled almost imperceptibly. Machines rarely failed where people expected them to. They failed where everyone believed perfection already existed. He reached toward a compact sensor module mounted beside a vibration dampener. His fingers stopped before touching it. Instead, he leaned closer and listened again. Tick, pause, tick, pause. "Interesting," he whispered. One engineer stepped forward. "What did you find?" Ethan looked up. "Not what I found. What I did not find." Confused glances spread across the room. Victoria took another step closer. "Explain." Ethan rested the wrench on the floor. Every healthy system has tiny imperfections, small variations, small corrections. This module is behaving too perfectly. Several engineers immediately opened new diagnostic windows, searching through thousands of lines of performance logs. Everything still appeared normal. Ethan gently loosened two mounting screws, less than a quarter turn each. He did not remove the component. He simply allowed it to settle naturally under its own weight. Then he adjusted it no more than the thickness of a business card before tightening the screws again. The entire process lasted less than 30 seconds. Nobody understood why such a tiny movement could possibly matter. Ethan slowly stood and brushed the dust from his hands. "Please restart the system," he said. The lead engineer hesitated before pressing the activation sequence. For one long second, nothing happened. Then a soft electronic chime echoed through the innovation center. One monitor illuminated. Then another. Hydraulic pressure quietly returned. Cooling fans accelerated into perfect synchronization. Across the enormous room, hundreds of status indicators shifted from red to green almost simultaneously. The towering prototype lifted its head with smooth mechanical precision as every internal subsystem awakened exactly as it had been designed to do. No cheers erupted. No applause. Broke the silence. The entire room simply stared, unable to explain how a man carrying an old repair case had accomplished in minutes what an entire team of specialists had failed to solve in 3 exhausting days. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The towering prototype completed its startup sequence with quiet confidence, every articulated movement smooth, every diagnostic display glowing a reassuring green. The enormous presentation screen refreshed automatically, replacing hundreds of critical alerts with a single line that read, "System status, fully operational." The silence felt heavier than the panic that had filled the room only minutes earlier. One investor slowly lowered his phone. Another leaned back in his chair, staring at the machine as though he had just witnessed something that refused to fit inside logic. The lead engineer hurried toward the nearest workstation, his fingers flying across the keyboard as fresh performance data streamed onto the monitors. Every subsystem reported perfect synchronization. Every calibration matched factory specifications. He checked the logs again, then a third time. Finally, he looked over his shoulder at Ethan, unable to hide the disbelief in his voice. That adjustment was less than half a millimeter. Ethan smiled gently. Sometimes half a millimeter is the difference between listening and assuming. No one answered. Victoria remained standing exactly where she had been, her attention fixed not on the robot, but on the quiet man gathering his flashlight and quarter-inch wrench as though the moment were already over. He carefully returned each tool to its proper place inside the old repair case, closing every latch with practiced precision. There was no celebration in his expression, no pride, no demand for recognition. He had solved the problem, and in his mind, the work was finished. "Wait," Victoria called. Ethan paused and turned. "Would you explain exactly what happened?" He walked back toward the machine without hesitation. "The sensor was never broken," he said. "It was installed under microscopic stress. Every time the frame warmed up, the housing expanded just enough to create a false vibration. Reading. The software trusted that reading and kept correcting a problem that never existed." Several engineers looked back at the assembly diagrams with growing astonishment. One quietly admitted, "We kept searching for software failures because the hardware passed every inspection." Ethan nodded. When intelligent systems become too complicated, people sometimes forget to ask simple questions. The words settled gently across the room. Nobody felt insulted. Instead, they sounded like wisdom earned through years of experience rather than criticism. Victoria slowly approached the sensor module herself, studying the tiny adjustment that had changed everything. "How did you know where to look?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the machine with quiet affection. Because machines cannot hide frustration. They always whisper before they fail. Most people are just too busy looking at screens to hear it. The room fell silent once more. Even the reporters stopped taking notes. Somewhere beyond the glass conference wall, sunlight drifted across the polished floor, softening the sharp reflections beneath everyone's feet. Victoria looked at Ethan differently now. She was no longer seeing a repair shop owner delivering a replacement part. She was looking at someone whose understanding reached beyond manuals, algorithms, and engineering degrees. There was discipline in his patience, humility in his confidence, grace in the way he accepted no praise for solving a crisis worth billions of dollars. As Ethan lifted his repair case and quietly turned toward the service exit, Victoria found herself asking a question she had never expected to ask a stranger. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "where did you learn to think like that?" Ethan stopped for only a moment. Without turning around, he answered in the calm voice that had already changed the atmosphere of the entire building, from making mistakes that nobody else had time to notice. Then he continued walking, leaving behind a room full of brilliant minds who suddenly realized they knew almost nothing about the quiet man disappearing through the same service door where he had entered. The service door closed softly behind Ethan. Yet Victoria did not return to the conference table. Instead, she remained beside the restored prototype, replaying every second of the past few minutes in her mind. Around her, conversations slowly returned, but they sounded different now. The engineers who had confidently dismissed the quiet repair shop owner were no longer defending their conclusions. They were questioning them. The lead systems architect enlarged the maintenance logs across 3 monitors and carefully compared every assembly record with Ethan's explanation. He was right, he admitted at last. The sensor was never defective. It was installed with almost invisible mechanical tension during final calibration. Another engineer leaned closer. Our software never had a chance. It trusted bad physical data from the beginning. Victoria listened without speaking. She had spent years rewarding intelligence, yet she suddenly wondered whether she had overlooked wisdom. There was a difference, and today a stranger had revealed it without raising his voice even once. She turned toward her executive assistant. "Find everything we have on Ethan Brooks." The assistant hesitated. "Do you mean the delivery contractor?" "No," Victoria answered quietly. "I mean the man who understood our machine better than the people who built it." Within minutes, information began appearing across her tablet. Business registration, tax records, local repair licenses, a modest garage on the edge of town. Nothing extraordinary. No advanced corporate affiliations. No consulting contracts. No recent engineering publications. It was almost disappointing. Then another employee entered the room carrying the delivery paperwork Ethan had signed earlier that morning. "His company has supplied custom machine components to us for almost 4 years," she said. Victoria looked up in surprise. "For years?" The employee nodded. "Always on time. Never a quality complaint. He personally delivers urgent orders whenever our suppliers fall behind." Victoria stared at the signature on the invoice. The handwriting was neat, steady, almost old-fashioned. She realized that Ethan had been quietly helping her company for years without anyone remembering his face. Outside the building, Ethan loaded the empty equipment case into the back of his aging pickup truck. The paint had faded under years of Texas sunlight, and the engine started with the familiar sound of a vehicle that had earned every mile honestly. Before pulling away, he glanced at the clock on the dashboard and smiled to himself. If traffic stayed light, he would make it home before his daughter finished her piano lesson. That mattered far more to him than billion-dollar contracts or executive boardrooms. As he drove away, Victoria stood inside her corner office watching the truck disappear beyond the security gate. Something about the man's priorities unsettled her. Most people chased larger offices, larger salaries, larger titles. Ethan had walked away from the most powerful room in the building without asking for recognition, payment, or even a business card. That kind of confidence could not be purchased. It had to be earned over a lifetime. A notification suddenly appeared on Victoria's tablet as the background search continued. An archived engineering database had found a decades-old patent citation connected to the name Ethan Brooks. She tapped the file almost absent-mindedly, expecting another routine maintenance record. Instead, her expression slowly changed. The first page displayed an engineering design submitted years before Langford Robotics had even existed. The technical drawings looked strangely familiar. Very familiar. She quickly opened the next page, then another. With every document, the impossible became harder to deny. The foundation of the breakthrough technology that had built her company's greatest success appeared to have begun with the quiet single father who had just driven away in an old pickup truck without looking back. Victoria remained in her office long after the investors had left, the evening sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor until the room glowed with warm amber light. Her tablet rested on the desk, displaying page after page of engineering records that refused to make sense. Every new document uncovered another connection. Every archive design carried the same name. Ethan Brooks. Patent. Applications filed more than 15 years earlier. Research papers presented at respected engineering conferences. Prototype sketches filled with handwritten notes that matched principles her company still relied upon today. She leaned back slowly, almost forgetting the untouched cup of coffee growing cold beside her. "How did nobody know this?" she whispered. Her chief technology officer entered quietly, carrying a thick folder that had been retrieved from an off-site archive. "You should see this," he said. Victoria opened the folder carefully. Inside were photographs from a national robotics competition held years before Langford Robotics existed. Standing at the center of one photograph was a much younger Ethan, wearing a simple blue shirt and smiling beside a groundbreaking autonomous prototype that had won the event by an overwhelming margin. Another photograph showed him receiving an innovation award from a panel of distinguished engineers. His expression looked exactly the same as it had earlier that afternoon. Calm, humble, uninterested in attention. "Why did he disappear?" Victoria asked. The chief technology officer turned another page. "He did not disappear. He simply stopped publishing." She continued reading. Interviews ended abruptly. Research funding requests were withdrawn. Conference invitations declined. Patent renewals quietly expired. It was as though one of the brightest engineering minds of his generation had simply walked away from everything. Then Victoria found a small newspaper clipping tucked inside the folder. It reported the death of Ethan's wife following a sudden illness many years earlier. Beneath the article was a single sentence stating that he had chosen to leave his research position in order to raise his young daughter full-time. Victoria closed the folder without saying a word. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Across town, Ethan was standing in his small garage with the wide door open to the cooling Texas evening. The familiar scent of machine oil mixed with freshly cut grass drifting in from nearby yards. A bicycle rested upside down on a repair stand while 8-year-old Lily Brooks sat on a wooden stool swinging her legs happily. "Did you fix another customer's truck today?" she asked with a bright smile. Ethan laughed softly. "Something a little different." Lily handed him a small wrench with complete confidence. "You always know which tool you need." Ethan accepted it with a grateful smile. "Only because I spent many years picking the wrong ones first." She giggled as he adjusted the bicycle chain with careful hands. There were no reporters waiting outside. No cameras. No executives. Just a father making sure his daughter would have a safe bicycle to ride the next morning. At that very moment, Victoria looked once more at the old competition photograph lying on her desk. The young inventor smiling back at the camera and the quiet repair shop owner she had met that afternoon were clearly the same man. Yet one question still remained unanswered. If Ethan Brooks had possessed the talent to change an entire industry, why had he chosen a life where almost nobody knew his name? Victoria reached for her car keys without hesitation. For the first time in many years, she was not chasing a business opportunity. She was searching for the truth behind a man who had quietly traded extraordinary success for something he believed was even more valuable. The sun had nearly disappeared beyond the quiet neighborhood when a black sedan rolled slowly to a stop across the street from Ethan's modest garage. Victoria remained inside for a moment, watching through the windshield instead of stepping out. She had expected to find a retired inventor surrounded by expensive equipment or trophies celebrating a remarkable career. Instead, she saw a weathered wooden workbench, neatly organized tools, and a father kneeling beside a little girl's bicycle with complete attention, as though nothing else in the world deserved more of his time. Lily laughed as the rear wheel spun freely after Ethan finished adjusting the chain. "Can I try it now?" she asked. Ethan smiled and gently lowered the bicycle onto the driveway. "One slow lap first," he answered. "We always make sure everything is safe before we go fast." Lily nodded seriously before climbing onto the bicycle and pedaling carefully down the sidewalk. Ethan watched every foot she traveled, not because he doubted her, but because protecting her had quietly become the purpose around which every day of his life revolved. Victoria stepped out of the car without announcing herself. Gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes. Ethan looked up and recognized her immediately, though no surprise appeared on his face. "Good evening," he said warmly. "Did the machine stop working again?" Victoria almost smiled. "No, it has not missed a single cycle since you left." Ethan nodded as though that was exactly what he had expected. He wiped his hands with an old shop towel before offering one toward her. "I am afraid it still has a little grease on it." Victoria accepted the handshake anyway. "I did not come because of the machine." Ethan waited patiently, He had learned long ago that silence often invited honesty more effectively than questions. After a long moment, Victoria looked around the small garage. Shelves held carefully labeled containers of bolts and bearings. A faded coffee mug rested beside a stack of engineering notebooks whose edges had softened with age. Nothing had been arranged to impress visitors. Everything reflected usefulness instead of status. "I found your patents," Victoria finally said. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. "I wondered if someone eventually would. You helped shape technology that my entire company depends on," she continued. "Why would you leave all of that behind?" Before Ethan could answer, Lily rode back into the driveway and stopped beside him with a huge smile. "Dad, look. No funny noises anymore." Ethan examined the bicycle for only a second before nodding proudly. "That means we fixed it together." Lily looked curiously toward Victoria. Ethan gently introduced them. "This is Miss Langford. We met at work today." Lily smiled politely. "Nice to meet you." Then she disappeared inside the house after reminding her father that dinner would be ready soon. Victoria watched the exchange quietly. There had been no interruption, no impatience, no embarrassment. Ethan had given his daughter the same calm respect he had shown billionaire executives only hours earlier. After the front door closed, Ethan looked toward the softly glowing kitchen window where Lily was setting the table. "When my wife passed away," he said quietly, "I had two choices. I could keep chasing recognition, or I could make certain my daughter never wondered whether she mattered less than my career." Victoria listened without speaking. "Awards cannot read bedtime stories," Ethan continued. "Patents cannot attend school concerts. Promotions cannot teach a child that she is loved every single day." His voice never wavered. There was no regret hidden inside his words, only peace earned through difficult choices. As the evening breeze drifted through the open garage, Victoria realized she was standing before a man who had measured success by a completely different standard, and somehow, despite everything he had given up, he seemed richer than anyone she had ever known. Victoria remained silent for a long moment, watching the warm light spilling through the kitchen window where Lily happily arranged 3 plates instead of 2, apparently assuming every visitor deserved a place at the table. That small gesture touched Victoria more deeply than she expected. In boardrooms, every invitation carried a purpose. Here, kindness required no explanation. Ethan noticed the extra plate and smiled softly. "She has always believed there is room for one more person." Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking. "I came here intending to offer you an executive position." Ethan looked at her with the same calm expression he had carried all day. "I imagined you might." She reached into her leather portfolio but stopped before removing the folder inside. For the first time in years, a carefully prepared contract suddenly felt unnecessary. "It includes a salary that would change your life," she said quietly. Ethan smiled with genuine gratitude rather than excitement. "That is generous. You would lead our research division," she continued. "You would have your own laboratory, your own engineering team, and every resource you could possibly need." Ethan glanced toward the kitchen window again. Lily was now carefully placing napkins beside each plate, while quietly humming to herself. He listened for a second before answering. "The most important team in my life already has 2 members." Victoria followed his gaze and finally understood what no financial report had ever taught her. Ethan had never rejected success. He had simply refused to let success decide who deserved the best hours of his day. She slowly closed the portfolio without taking the contract out. "You knew you would say no before I arrived, did not you?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Not exactly. I wanted to hear your offer because I respect the effort behind it." "Then why does it feel as though your decision has already been made?" He leaned lightly against the workbench, his weathered hands resting comfortably on the polished wood worn smooth by years of honest work. "Because every morning my daughter knows I will be here before she leaves for school, and every evening she knows I will still be here when she comes home. That certainty is worth more to her than any title I could ever accept." The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the kitchen, followed by Lily's cheerful voice calling through the screen door. "Dad, dinner is ready." Ethan answered with the same warmth that filled every word he spoke to her. "We will be right there." Victoria smiled almost instinctively. "She sounds happy." Ethan nodded. "She has taught me that happiness is usually much quieter than ambition." Those words lingered between them. Victoria realized she had spent years measuring achievement by market value, company growth, and public recognition. Yet standing in a modest garage beside a man with grease on his hands, she suddenly felt that her own definition had been incomplete. She looked once more at the unopened contract inside her portfolio, then carefully removed it and folded it in half before placing it back inside without presenting it. "I came here to recruit an engineer," she admitted. "Instead, I found someone who reminded me what success is supposed to protect." Ethan said nothing. He simply offered a grateful smile. It was the kind of quiet dignity that demanded nothing and yet somehow earned everything. As Victoria turned toward her car, she paused one final time. A new idea had already begun taking shape in her mind, one that would not ask Ethan Brooks to leave the life he loved, but would instead honor the life he had already chosen with remarkable grace. 3 weeks later, a small crowd gathered outside Ethan's garage on a bright Saturday morning. There were no television cameras, no giant advertising banners, and no speeches prepared for shareholders. Instead, folding chairs filled the parking lot while local families, vocational students, and young mechanics stood together with quiet curiosity. A freshly painted sign rested beside the entrance. It read, "Brooks Technical Learning Workshop, established through the Langford Community Innovation Fund." There was no corporate logo printed across the top. No executive name appeared in larger letters than anyone else's. Victoria had insisted on that. She wanted the place to belong to the community, not to her company. Ethan stood near the open garage door greeting every visitor with the same warm handshake, whether they arrived wearing expensive business suits or worn work boots. Lily hurried from table to table carrying homemade cookies she had baked the night before. She proudly introduced herself to every guest, telling them that her father could fix almost anything, but always reminded her that people mattered more than machines. Those simple words made several visitors smile. Victoria arrived quietly without an announcement. She carried no security entourage and no prepared remarks. As she walked through the garage, she noticed young students gathered around old engines, carefully listening while Ethan explained how every machine rewarded patience before speed. He never spoke down to anyone. When a teenager made a mistake while measuring a worn bearing, Ethan simply smiled and said, "Every expert you admire once measured that same part incorrectly. The difference is that they learned instead of pretending they already knew." The students laughed softly before trying again with renewed confidence. Victoria watched the scene in silence. She realized that Ethan was doing something no executive handbook could teach. He was not simply passing along technical knowledge. He was building confidence, character, and respect one quiet conversation at a time. Later that afternoon, as the final visitors prepared to leave, Victoria walked over to Ethan while Lily swept the garage floor with cheerful determination. "I have spent years investing in technology," Victoria said. "Today I learned that the greatest investment is believing in people before they believe in themselves." Ethan looked around the garage filled with smiling students, repaired equipment, and neighbors talking like old friends. "Machines eventually wear out," he replied. "Skills last much longer. Kindness lasts even longer than that." Victoria extended her hand once again, but this time it was not to offer a contract. It was simply an expression of respect freely given and gratefully returned. Ethan accepted the handshake with the same quiet dignity he had shown from the beginning. Neither of them needed to say anything more. The setting sun poured golden light through the open garage door, illuminating rows of ordinary tools that had quietly become instruments of hope for the next generation. Lily looked up at her father and smiled the way only a child completely certain of being loved can smile. Ethan smiled back without a single trace of regret. He had once possessed the talent to transform an industry, but he had chosen first to shape a life defined by grace, responsibility, and second chances. In the end, the greatest miracle was never that he restored a remarkable machine in only a few minutes. It was that he never allowed success to take away the quiet dignity that made him extraordinary long before anyone finally noticed.